everyone, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Prosperity Checks. Hello there. I wonder how many Grays Harbor residents can recall the hard days of the early 1930s. With the nation's prosperity soaring to an all-time high, and everyone working, or at least able to find jobs if they wanted them, and lots of us have forgotten that there were such a things as breadlines, the Forgotten Man, the Dole, the WPA, and all the other manifestations of national depression that sent us into a tailspin back in the early 1930s. But it was pretty real to us then, and it had some phases that were worth recording, and I think worth a second look back. And one of the most interesting was the Prosperity Check campaign that the Aberdeen citizens promoted, and that got the town a lot of publicity all over the Northwest. It was an idea borrowed from an old Chinese custom, and the people of the harbor dug into it and made it work, just as the Chinese had before them. So when George has taken his few customary seconds for a word from our sponsor, we'll open our scrapbook to the story of the Prosperity Checks, of one of the most colorful manifestations of the community fighting back the tide of depression in those unhappy years of the early 1930s. The year of 1931 came to Grays Harbor, bringing little enthusiasm for its coming and not too much hope for its promise. But January 1931, the residents of the harbor had concluded that perhaps prosperity was not just around the corner, and maybe there was something wrong with the system of ours. The Salvation Army was conducting a breadline and flop houses for homeless men, and John Troop of Aberdeen's welfare office had a full-time job on his hands to keep up with the hungry people and supply them with enough of the essentials for life to keep them going. If you had forgotten just when that was, let's make that the veterans had begun their march on Washington, D.C., where they were to be routed from their campgrounds by General MacArthur's troop at the points of bayonets. The Aberdeen High School had just concluded its annual hijinks, starring, amongst other, Johnny Parcell and Don Fosberg. Hoquiam's Mayor Shaw was trying to appoint Walter Lovejoy water superintendent against the opposition of the council, and an Arkansas family of 4 who lived 2 weeks on $2.50 to get their picture in the paper from coast to coast. Every family had its share of problems, and most of them were traceable to the dollar and cents that America had spent so careful and gay during the booming 1920s. And the businessman of Grays Harbor, like the average householder, was plagued with a problem: how to collect his old debts. Aberdeen businessmen clustering around the official desk of the Chamber of Commerce, Secretary Federhoff, spent half of their time wondering how they might wipe some of their old billings off the books and get in a little cash on which to operate. It was either collect or close the doors. Goodbar Jones, Aberdeen realtor and investment man, had been to such a meeting one morning, and sitting in his office in the Finch building, he looked down Heron Street amused. The Chinese had a way of handling such things, he said to Orland Duell, secretary at Jones & Jones Savings Department. The Chinese had a way of doing it. Now what was that? Orland wasn't a student of Chinese ways and customs, and he went on trying to figure out how the Savings and Loan Association was going to pay interest on its deposit if something didn't come in to pay interest to it. But Goodbar continued to drum the table with his pencil and look down Heron Street. Then it came to him. Why, it was a New Year's custom in the Orient. Every year, they gather in the marketplace of the old cafe, and everyone brought enough money to pay one bill. Then they all began to pay each other's bills. And when the New Year's Day was over, everyone had paid and been paid and paid and been paid many times, and all the debts, or most of them, were marked off the books. But would Grays Harbor's people gather at the corner of Broadway and Heron Street and pay bills? No, it wasn't likely. But the germs of the idea was there, and Goldberg pushed it back and forth across the furrows of his agile brain all that day. He talked it over with Earl Hunt at the Elks Club that noon, and Earl added an idea. And that night, Goodbar worked it out. If everyone wrote one check that was earmarked especially to pay a bill, and he paid a bill with it, then soon everyone would be paying bills with checks. Let's say that 1,000 people each wrote a check for $10, and each marked the check for payment of bills only. And if each person kept that check in circulation by paying a bill with it every time he got one, say every day, then $10,000 worth of old bills would be paid every day. He did some figuring with his pencil, and the next day he went across Heron Street to talk it over with Jim Marlett. That afternoon, around Federhoff's table, Goodbar laid out his plan. 1,000 people would write checks, take them to the Chamber of Commerce, and have them mounted on a special form for endorsement. Take them to the bank and have them certified. Then the word go. Everyone would start to pay bills with his checks, and every time anyone got such a check, he was to rush right out and pay a bill with it. The scene sounded good to a desperate businessman of the harbor. They were ready and willing to give anything a try. That night the newspaper told the story. The Pay Bills campaign would last for 6 weeks. They hoped to pay $45,000 worth of bills during the period, with 1,000 checks written for payment of bills only. So on January 31st, 1931, the campaign began. It was doubtful that there were 1,000 residents of Aberdeen who could write checks for $10. The year of 1930 had been rough on bank accounts. Savings, loans, and funds were tied up. Cash on hand had dwindled to a dangerous reserve in most families. But more than 500 wrote the checks and took them, one of them, to the banks to be certified. Then over to the chamber for the endorsement slip that was marked with a big letter for payment of bills only. Keep money in circulation. Firms paying that day, it was the end of the month, paid $10 of the employee's salary with such a check. None of the checks would be redeemed at the banks until March 16th. It was a 6-week drive to put more money into circulation on Grays Harbor. The first week the campaign worked beyond its backers' fondest expectation. A check written by J.S. Wogg was returned to his store, and 4 hours later it had been issued in payment of a bill. It had been endorsed 7 times, meaning that it had paid $70 worth of bills. It came back to pay a long overdue bill at Wogg's drugstore. A check written by Secretary Earl Hunt at the Elks changed hands 10 times in 3 days to pay $100 worth of old bills. A check paid out by Joe Barkley paid $170 worth of old bills in 4 days. Earl Morgan, the showman, called it the greatest idea that had hit to put money into circulation. Aberdeen suddenly found itself paying bills at the rate of nearly $7,000 a day, and every day more of the checks were going into circulation as the town got into the spirit, or $10 less, as the case might be. It was a great 6 weeks for Aberdeen. Bill McBride and Dave Dixon came down from Elma to see how it worked, and they prepared to try it. If it worked out well, Ed Fitzgerald, whom no one recognized as a future radio entertainer with a salary in the 6 figures, was managing the new Warner Brothers Theater. He recommended it to Hollywood as an answer to a bad bill. Kalispell, Montana, and Leavenworth, Washington sent men to see how it worked. Ralph Shepard, secretary of the Olympia Chamber of Commerce, came down to see how it worked. Everyday people took their $10 checks, their own and other ones that had come in, and set out to pay a bill or two. Merchants and business firms taking the checks in promptly turned around and paid bills with them. Other things were happening too. Grays Harbor baker Eddie Myers took the month to announce a new breaded bread to be baked by his firm. The business district of Pacific Beach went up in flames. E.B. Carey blasted the Aberdeen City Council for corruption and police gaffe, and the old Aberdonian, Tom Blythe, died in California. Young Dick Street won the high school oratorial contest, and the bills paying went on. Through the month of February, it made news almost daily. It was decided to give a trophy to the firm whose check paid the most bills, and it was placed on display in the window of the Jones & Jones on Heron Street. Aberdeen people, the town told itself, would be out of debt by March 16th if this kept up. And there were signs that the big drive was succeeding. More than $40,000 worth of bills were paid up in the first weeks of the campaign. Tacoma sent a man down to see how Aberdeen was lifting itself out of the depression by the bootstraps. By the 4th of March, the average check in circulation had 20 signatures, and Eureka, California was interested in Aberdeen's golden venture. Well, the 16th of March came finally, and the sponsors of the project toted up the results. As the checks came in to the banks, they counted the endorsements and found an average of 20 endorsements per check. They found 696 $10 checks in their campaign. They did a bit of figuring and estimated that Aberdeen had wiped out nearly $140,000 worth of bills during their 6-week drive. And all over the Northwest, it was front page news that the town of Aberdeen, down there on Grays Harbor, had dreamed up a bouncing check game that paid bills automatically. Now half of the towns in the state wanted to try it. Down at Jones & Jones on Heron Street, manager Goodbar was busy with his book called The Strangest Customs of the Chinese. It had been given to him by a friend who requested, "Find another good one in there that will produce new business, and we'll make you the next president." Yes, that was Grays Harbor's excitement in January 1931. And now here's George Edgar and a few words from our sponsor. Those who endured the hard years of the Depression as they came to Grays Harbor will recall only too clearly the trying times of that unhappy era. But they may be able to look back with a chuckle to Aberdeen's prosperity checks and the scheme that worked, the scheme that folks called Goodbar Jones' perpetual motion picture, and that wrote a few interesting lines for the story and earn a place tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.